Hi, I thought today we would have a short video on the Battle of Culloden, the anniversary of which is the 16th of April. In my mind, it was a farce. It was a badly planned, badly executed event on the part of the Scots, which may have had a better outcome were it not for their chosen leader, the man affectionately known as Bonnie Prince Charlie. Now, just to begin, Bonnie Prince Charlie was vying for the Scottish throne, but he believed that he had a right to the Scottish throne, a God-given right to rule over the Scottish people. Now, we already know that the claim of right from the end of the 17th century, really about 50 years before this event, stated very clearly, in no uncertain terms, that the Scots people were sovereign, that if they were to have a monarch, it would be a monarch agreed upon by the Scottish people, who was there solely to do for and act on behalf of the Scottish people. There was no God-given right in this, not as far as the Scots were concerned. Bonnie Prince Charlie had failings that the Scots were not unaware of. Had they had another obvious option, they may have gone for that instead, but they ended up with Charlie Boy. So they knew that he left a lot to be desired with regards a monarch of the Scots. He didn't really fit the bill in their minds, but the Union was already proving to be disastrous for Scotland. So we're talking about the Union of 1707 here with England. And a mere 6 years after that union was ratified, a couple of the Scots lords, Seafield and Finlater, who had signed off on the incorporated union, realised exactly what was in store for Scotland, that she was going to be taken for everything she had, that they had little to no voice within this new British Parliament because they were so underrepresented as opposed to the English MPs. Finlater and Seafield inspired a debate to be held in the House of Lords, and the debate was, can Scotland leave the Union, please? Basically. And they failed by a mere 4 votes in regard to this question. We were that close to being out the Union a mere 6 years after it was enacted. Then you had the 1715 rebellion under James, which failed, and the Battle of Culloden, or the 45 rebellion, was really part 2 of a civil war and was born of sentiments that hadn't been dampened any after the rebellion of 1715. Pretty quickly after the union with England was concluded, the same lords who got cushy seats and not so anonymous sums of money realised that the deal they'd struck wasn't exactly what they'd hoped for. And we have from the London Evening Standard for the Thursday the 24th of April 1834, an attempt was made by some Scotch peers shortly after the Union to have their Union also repealed. The Earl of Finlater moved the repeal of the Union in 1713 on the ground that Scotland had made a bad bargain, and the Earl of Finlater moved the repeal of the Union with Scotland because England had violated the bargain. What did the Duke of Argyll say on the occasion? These are his words. If the Union is not dissolved, no property would be left in the country, and Scotland would be the most miserable country on earth. The Scottish people were in the belief that should they win the right to their own king, in the case of the 1715 it was James, known as the Old Pretender, while in 1745 at Culloden it was of course Bonnie Prince Charlie, the still fresh union would be easily ended, giving Scotland back to the control of her people and Parliament. They felt like Charles taking the throne of Scotland, he could just dissolve that union with little to no effort. So while they understood his failings as a monarch who had plans to rule over the Scots, who saw themselves as sovereign, they had a goal to be attained here, and he was the means to the end. After the union was ended, they could work it out afterwards, with regards to their monarchy. So W.J. O'Neill Daunt, in an article entitled Home Rule, the Scotch Union, Letter from Mr. Daunt, from the Dublin Weekly Nation for Saturday the 25th of November 1871, states, at subsequent dates, many Scotchmen took up arms to restore the House of Stuart, much more from a belief that their restoration would be followed or accompanied by the restoration of the Scotch Parliament, than from love of the fallen dynasty. The insurrections of 1715 and 1745 were, to a great extent, attempts to repeal the Union by force of arms. Thus the Union had its share in producing the horrors of civil war. It apparently wouldn't have taken much to have achieved this result, as Edinburgh barrister Charles Waddy tells us in his excellent How Scotland Lost Her Parliament in 1891 publication. We know that it is a prevailing opinion in our day that the Jacobites were confined to the Highlands, but this is very far from the truth. The prince's adherents were everywhere. The whole country was honeycombed with secret societies and Jacobite clubs. The Scots were not so foolish as to desire a despot out of sympathy with their religion and opposed in principle to their ideas of civil and religious liberty. Had the exiled prince learned wisdom in adversity and identified himself with the sentiments of the people over whom he aspired to reign, he would have commanded the universal homage of Scotland, and no power that England could have brought against him would have deprived him of that kingdom. But the doomed race of the Stuarts were unable to shake themselves free from the trammels of their early education, and so stuck to the divine right of kings and the absolute duty of submission on the part of the people. It was for that reason alone that the government had any adherents in Scotland. So the country was divided into two parts, those who clung to constitutional government and the Jacobites, whose romantic loyalty made them forget all the defects of their idol. The Battle of Culloden was just a Jacobite slaughter. Charles did not make for a very good strategist. He had a goal in sight, and it didn't seem to really matter how he got there or how many died attempting to gain it for him. This is where we meet the Duke of Cumberland. In the 1847 Gazetteer of Scotland for the town of Nairn were given at least a partial reason for their defeat. The population in England, overawed by the victorious Highlanders on their march south, now thought they could fall upon their retreating foe with impunity. One or two sharp lessons which the Highlanders gave them soon cured them, however, of their temerity, and even the Duke of Cumberland and his disciplined troops were taught to respect their enemy. Large reinforcements awaited Charles on his return to Scotland, and had the French government fulfilled even a respectable part of their large promises, the war might have been protracted for some considerable time. A transient gleam of returning fortune came to the prince's army at Falkirk, where the boastful General Hawley received a severe lesson. The fear of invasion of the south of England being now removed, the Duke of Cumberland hastened to Scotland and took command of the army. The Highlanders had retreated into their own country, where the last tragedy of this deplorable insurrection was about to be played. On the 16th of April, 1746, was fought the decisive Battle of Culloden. The army of Prince Charles consisted of about 5,000 men. The Duke of Cumberland had 9,000 troops under his command, with all the most approved appliances of war. For the first time, the Highland army had been opposed by a capable general. With such overwhelming numbers, victory was assured, and that Charles should have risked his all on such an unequal contest can only be accounted for by madness or despair. By this ill-considered action, 1,000 brave men lay dead on the field, for the victorious army, especially the cavalry, who had played such a poor part in former encounters, took a mean revenge upon the vanquished foe, and slew the wounded without mercy. They made diligent search among the neighbouring huts into which the wounded had crawled, and took the helpless wretches and shot them in cold blood. There are none so cruel as cowards. The extremity of their past terrors gives a particular zest to the ferocity with which they treat their victims when they fall into their power. It is said the Duke of Cumberland was a brave man. If so, he acted with the malice of a coward. His military executions in the Highlands covered his name with infamy and shocked the moral sense of the whole Christian world. Man, woman, and child fell before his relentless arms. Even Robert Chambers, whose writings were penned and tempered for an English audience, wrote in his 1886 Book of Days for the 16th of April. On the 16th of April 1746 was fought the Battle of Culloden. The Duke of Cumberland, who commanded the army of the government, used his victory with notable harshness and cruelty, not only causing a needless slaughter among the fugitives, but ordering large numbers of the wounded to be fusilladed on the field, a fact often doubted, but which has been fully proved. He probably acted under an impression that Scotland required a severe lesson to be read to her, the reigning idea in England being that the northern kingdom was in rebellion, whereas the insurgents represented but a small party of the Scottish people, to whom in general the descent of a parcel of the Highland clans with Charles Edward Stuart was as much a surprise as it was to the court of St. James's. In TDL Orders' 1881 Tales of the Highlands, a conversation the author had one night in a bothy on the subject of Cumberland's actions after his success at Culloden contains an interesting piece of information. Clifford. Is it possible that the Duke of Cumberland could have authorised such atrocities as the hanging up innocent servants in the way you describe it, Mr. Macpherson? Dominie Macpherson. I am afraid that what I have asserted is but too true, sir. The author. I am sorry to say that I am in possession of a document which but too satisfactorily proves that he did give most cruel orders. It is an orderly book of the 37th Regiment, which was called Cholmondeley's Regiment, and in that I find, in the general orders dated the camp at Inverness, April 17th, 1746, the following entry. A captain and 50 foot to march directly and visit all the cottages in the neighbourhood of the field of battle, and to search for rebels. The officers and men will take notice that the public orders of the rebels yesterday was to give us no quarters. This, I think, was a pretty broad hint to the men and the officer commanding them what it was that the Duke expected of them. Grant. Very distinct indeed. The author. Not to be mistaken, I think. Clifford. Is there anything existing to establish that any such order was given by the Prince previous to the battle, as to that which the Duke here alludes? Author. Not a vestige of anything that I am aware of, but if such orders had been given by the Prince, that circumstance would have afforded no apology for him to have issued the order I have now repeated to you, after the battle was over, and the enemy so effectually cut to pieces in the field. Nothing, I think, could more mark a sanguinary temper than his thus letting loose a body of men to visit all the neighbouring cottages and to put to death, in cold blood, all whom his ignorant and bloodthirsty myrmidons might choose to consider as rebels. The slaughter in this way of the innocent, as well as of the guilty, was said to have been immense. Clifford. The picture is horrible. Grant. It is horrible to think of it, even at this great distance of time. James Grant details in his 1880 publication Old and New Edinburgh a consequence of the Jacobite defeat with regards Edinburgh Castle. Many unfortunate Jacobites have suffered most protracted periods of imprisonment within its walls. Among these, the Edinburgh Courant records, for 12 months in 1746 they were confined in a small, horrid and unhealthy chamber above the portcullis, used for many a year as the black hole of the garrison, the Duchess of Perth, and the Viscountess Strathallan, with her daughters, the Ladies Mary and Amelia, who were brought in by an escort of 20 dragoons under a ruffianly quartermaster, who treated them with every indignity, even to tearing the wedding ring from Lady Strathallan's finger, and stripping her daughters of their clothes. During the long year these noble ladies were in that noisome den above the gate. They were without female attendants, and under the almost hourly surveillance of the sergeants of the guard. The husband of the Countess was slain at the head of his men on the field of Culloden, where the Jacobite clans were overcome by neither skill nor valour, but the sheer force of numbers and starvation. Donald MacLeod speaks of Cumberland and some of the immediate effects of Culloden in his publication Gloomy Memories, an 1892 publication. No doubt the Duke of Cumberland, the most obnoxious, cowardly monster that ever disgraced humanity, commissioned his followers to acts of murder, plunder, and violence. In that unfortunate year the Black Act was enacted, which deprived the Caledonians of their national garb, of their arms, and forbade them to wear either under the pains and penalties of heavy fines, long imprisonment, and banishment. This nefarious act was in force and strictly watched for 32 years, which is equal to a generation. Our poets and reprovers of evil, cowardly deeds, and the recorders of the deeds of valiant men were silenced, and many of them made a narrow escape from the gallows for their pensive memoirs of the fallen at Culloden, on the day when Scotland was prostrated at the foot of her avowed enemy, a day pregnant with degradation, slavery, and the desolation and misery I have to record. All the Gallic manuscripts in history that could be discovered by hook or by crook was seized, destroyed, or locked up. The deprival of national garb is elaborated on by John F. Campbell in the notes to Volume 4 of his publication Popular Tales of the West Highlands, 1893. Section 17 of the 19th George II Act of Parliament provides for the dress. After the 1st of August 1747 it was unlawful for civilians, on any pretence whatsoever, to wear or put on the clothes commonly called Highland clothes, that is to say, the plaid, philibeg or little kilt, trowse, shoulder belts, or any part whatsoever of what peculiarly belongs to the Highland garb, and that no tartan or party-coloured plaid or stuff shall be used for greatcoats or for upper coats. The penalty was, for a first offence, 6 months' imprisonment, and 7 years' transportation for a second offence. As no provision was made for clothing those whom the legislature thus stripped, as the climate is severe and unfit for the cultivation of figs, and the people were poor, and as loyal districts were included, this might be called the Act for the Uncivilization of the Highlands and the Profit of Cloth Workers. Retribution, after the Battle of Culloden, got quite petty as well. It's mentioned in the publication Old and New Edinburgh that the banners of the Jacobite clans were burned at Edinburgh Cross. With a spite that seems childish now, by order of Cumberland, those standards, whose insignia were all significant of high descent and old achievement, were carried in procession to the cross. The common hangman bore that of Charles, 13 tronmen or sweeps bore the rest, and all were flung into a fire, guarded by the 44th Regiment, while the heralds proclaimed the name of each chief to whom they belonged. Lochiel, Clanranald, Keppoch, Glengarry, and so forth, while the crowd looked on in silence. By this proceeding, so petty in its character, Cumberland failed alike to inflict an injury on the character of the chiefs or their faithful followers, among whom at that dire time the bayonet, the gibbet, the torch, and the axe were everywhere at work. Those Scottish Jacobites who had been taken prisoner against Article 19 of the recently signed Treaty of Union were brought down to England and tried under that country's treason laws. From a contemporary Derby Mercury article from Halloween 1746 were given that Tuesday the court sat at St Margaret's Hill, Southwark, for trying the rebel prisoners. Point of law moved on Tuesday by the Council for the Prisoners, which was whether those who are natives of Scotland, resident in Scotland, had committed acts of treason in Scotland, and were taken in Scotland, could, without a breach of the Union, be tried in England. Scots felt that a Secretary of State for their country would be an important intermediary acting between them and the Westminster Parliament. However, we're told from the Aberdeen Free Press of the 11th of April 1885 that insult was added to injury in this regard. In an article entitled Aberdeen Juridical Society, addressed by Sheriff Guthrie Smith, it reads, "In a letter to Lord Ailey, Walpole discloses what was the intention of the government with respect to the management of Scottish affairs. It may not be improper, he says, to acquaint you that the scheme is to put an end to the office of Scotch Secretary, and accordingly, although it was revived for a time in the person of Lord Selkirk in the year 1731, the office finally disappeared in 1746, with the resignation of Lord Tweedale, along with the rest of the Granville cabinet. When the Pelham ministry was formed, it appears at one time to have been intended to appoint Duke of Argyll as secretary, but the Duke of Cumberland, who, since his successful suppression of the rebellion on the field of Culloden, was allowed an authority in Scottish affairs, out of all proportion to his abilities, and for which the disturbed state of the Highlands was the only excuse, gave his voice against it. So he actually ended up with more of a say over Scottish affairs than even the Scottish lords of the time. There is a wee mention later on in the Book of Days for January the 16th of an incident 3 years after Culloden in London that got Cumberland worked up. He was at the Haymarket Theatre and the star attraction had failed to show up. A young gentleman threw a lighted candle upon the stage and a general charge upon that part of the house followed. According to a private letter to which we have had access, it was written by a Scotch Jacobite lady. Cumberland was the first that flew in a rage and called to pull down the house. He drew his sword and was in such a rage that somebody slipped in behind him and pulled the sword out of his hand, which was as much to say, fools should not have chopping sticks. This sword of his has never been heard tell of, nor the person who took it. 30 guineas of reward are offered for it. Monster of nature, I am sure I wish he may never get it." And 4 years after Culloden, Grant tells us of a disturbance in the Canongate Theatre in Edinburgh from his old New Edinburgh. After the affair of 1745, the audiences were apt to display a spirit of political dissension. On the anniversary of the Battle of Culloden in 1749, some English officers who were in the theatre commanded the orchestra, in an insolent and unruly manner, to strike up an obnoxious air known as Culloden. But in a spirit of opposition and to please the people, the musicians played "You're Welcome, Charlie Stewart." The military at once drew their swords and attacked the defenceless musicians and players, but were assailed by the audience with torn-up benches and every missile that could be procured. The officers now attempted to storm the galleries, but the doors were secured. They were then vigorously attacked in the rear by the Highland chairmen with their poles, disarmed and most ignominiously drubbed and expelled. To end us, we're going to quote from Burton's History of Scotland, and it sums up Scotland's relationship with Westminster from the time of the Union until the present day. Many of the calamities following on the Union had much encouragement. If they did not spring, soon that haughty English nature, which would not condescend to sympathise in or even know the peculiarities of their new fellow countrymen, the pervading historical character of the events immediately following the Union is that English statesmen, had they desired to alienate Scotland and create a premature revulsion against the Union, could not have pursued a course better adapted to such an end. The position of the countries demanded a delicate and cautious policy. Scotland had to go through the intermediate perceptible evils of a departed nationality, a decaying retail trade, and increased taxation. The countervailing benefits from extended enterprise lay in the future. A paternal government would, on such an occasion, have carefully avoided everything that irritated national pride or prejudices, and seemed, however slightly, to sacrifice the interests or independence of one country to the other. But in almost every one of the changes just enumerated, the offensive act was offensively done, and the country was ever reminded that she was in the hands of ungenial and uninterested, if not hostile, strangers. So, there's a little bit about Culloden, mainly the after effects of Culloden, which were long-lasting and set us back in the pursuance of obtaining rights for Scotland within the Union. And I hope it was of interest. I just felt like, as it was that time of year, once again, I would get into it with some quotes to back up my feelings as to how the whole thing was mismanaged, is probably the nicest way of putting it. So I may see you for the next one. Take care. Fools should not have chopping sticks.